Hi, I'm Emily Hayes, and I'm 29 years old. On what should have been a perfect Christmas Eve, my fiance Daniel was looking through my old family photos and saw something that made his blood run cold. He turned to me and whispered a question that would unravel my entire life. Don't you see it? Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe and drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from. The air in our Seattle home was thick with the scent of pine needles and my mom's gingerbread cookies. Snow dusted the windows, muffling the sounds of the city and wrapping our little living room in a cozy, festive bubble. It was Christmas Eve, my favorite night of the year. For the first time in a long time, everything felt right. My fiancé, Daniel, sat beside me on the couch, his arm wrapped warmly around my shoulders. My parents, for once, weren't bickering over politics or my dad's retirement plan. They were just happy. I leaned my head against Daniel's shoulder, soaking in the quiet peace. This was the life I wanted. The calm, the warmth, the feeling of being completely and utterly safe. I had spent so much of my 20s feeling adrift, but with Daniel, I had finally found an anchor. Oh, let's get out the old albums, my mom, Linda, announced, her voice bright with the forced holiday cheer she always adopted in December. It used to annoy me, but tonight I welcomed it. My dad, from his worn leather armchair, chuckled. Linda, don't you dare! You'll scare the boy away with pictures of Emily's awkward phase. He winked at Daniel. There was a solid 2 years of headgear and pigtails, son. You sure you're ready for that? I've seen her morning hair, Tom. I'm not scared of anything, Daniel replied smoothly, earning a laugh from my dad. Nonsense, my mom said, already pulling a stack of heavy, leather-bound books from the bottom of the bookshelf. Here we are, first family vacation to Disneyland. We spent the next hour lost in the past. The pictures were a parade of forgotten moments. There was my older brother, Mark, with a terrible bowl cut, beaming proudly next to a lopsided sandcastle. There I was at age 5, covered head to toe in mud, crying because a frog had jumped on my shoe. We laughed until our sides hurt at a photo of my dad in tiny 1980s running shorts, a sight so jarring Daniel had to pretend to shield his eyes. Okay, that's enough of that one, my dad grumbled, though a smile played on his lips. My mom turned the page. Oh, look, Emily, your third birthday party. I groaned, the one where Mark pushed my face into the cake. He was just excited, she said dismissively, a familiar excuse. Daniel squeezed my hand, a silent acknowledgement. He knew the stories about Mark, the golden child, and how his actions were always reframed as enthusiasm, while mine were labeled dramatic. Then my mom opened the third album. This one was from when I was a toddler, before Mark was born, from the years my parents now rarely spoke of. The photos were older, the colors more faded. Oh, this one's my favorite, she said, tapping a finger on a picture of me in a bright yellow sundress, sitting on a picnic blanket in a park. Daniel reached for the heavy book. Let me see my girl. He took the album, resting it on his lap. He slowly turned the thick plastic-covered pages, a soft smile on his face as he looked at photos of a chubby-cheeked baby who was apparently me. I watched his face, enjoying the way his eyes lit up. But then the light in his eyes went out. He stopped turning the pages. His fingers, which had been gently tracing the edges of the photos, went completely still. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, sharp stillness. It was as if a mask had dropped, revealing a stranger. His face drained of all color, leaving his skin a pasty, sick-looking white. He was staring, not at the whole page, but at one single photograph. The silence stretched. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Dan? I whispered, nudging him gently. You okay? He didn't answer. He didn't even seem to hear me. His focus was absolute. He leaned closer to the album, his brow furrowed in a way I'd never seen before, not in frustration or concentration, but in a kind of horrified disbelief. The photo he was staring at was a group shot from a neighborhood barbecue. My dad was at the grill, a plume of smoke rising around him. My mom was talking to a neighbor, her head thrown back in laughter. And there I was, a tiny figure in the background, playing near a large oak tree. It was a simple, unremarkable picture. I'd seen it 100 times and never given it a second thought. Daniel, what is it? I'm scaring you, I said, my voice a little louder this time, a tremor of panic in it. My mom let out a nervous little laugh. What's the matter, Daniel? See a ghost? He finally lifted his head. His gaze shifted from the photo to my mom, then to my dad, a silent, searching look that made my blood run cold. My father's easygoing expression tightened. My mother's smile faltered, replaced by a strained, blank look. Something unspoken was passing between them, a current of panic I couldn't understand. Finally, Daniel's eyes met mine. They were dark with an emotion I couldn't place. Shock, fear, and something else. Pity. He swallowed hard, and when he spoke, his voice was a raw, low whisper that cut through the festive air like a shard of glass. Don't you see it? See what? I asked, my voice barely audible. The beautiful, perfect bubble of my Christmas Eve had just burst. I took the album from his lap, my hands shaking slightly. I looked down at the picture, my heart pounding against my ribs. It was just a blurry, faded photo from a summer day nearly 30 years ago. Just my parents, our neighbors, and me, a little girl in a yellow dress playing by a tree. I stared and stared, tracing the grainy outlines of the people, the tree, the house in the background. I saw nothing. Absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. To understand why I saw nothing in that photograph, you have to understand my family. You have to understand the role I was born to play. I grew up here in Seattle, in the same house that now felt cold and strange. It was always me, my parents, John and Margaret, and my older brother, Ethan. To call Ethan the star of our family would be an understatement. He was the sun, and we were all just planets caught in his orbit, existing only to reflect his light. Ethan was 2 years older, and from the moment he could walk, he was destined for greatness in my parents' eyes. He was the athlete, the golden boy. He had a confidence that filled every room he entered, a charisma that drew people in. Our home was a shrine to his achievements. The mantelpiece wasn't for family photos, it was for Ethan's soccer trophies, each one polished weekly by my mother. The refrigerator wasn't covered in my crayon drawings, but with newspaper clippings detailing the stats from his latest high school football game, the paper yellowing at the edges but never taken down. His old, framed number 7 jersey hung in the hallway like a holy relic. My father, John, a man of few words and even fewer emotions, became a roaring superfan at Ethan's games. He would stand on the sidelines, his voice hoarse from shouting, his face beaming with a pride I never saw directed at me. I think he saw a younger, better version of himself in Ethan, a chance to live out the athletic glories he never had. My mother, Margaret, was the team mom, the booster club president, the organizer of victory parties. For her, Ethan's success was a social currency, proof that she had raised a winner. Their lives revolved around Ethan's schedule, his needs, his triumphs. And me? I was the afterthought. I wasn't a bad kid. I was quiet, I got good grades, I did what I was told. But my achievements were silent. A report card with all A's was met with a distracted, "That's nice, honey, now pass the salt." A painting I was proud of earned a quick glance before the conversation turned back to Ethan's upcoming tournament. My role was to be invisible, to not cause a fuss, and to support the main event, my brother. I have a memory that feels like the summary of my entire childhood. I was 9 years old, sitting on cold metal bleachers during one of Ethan's soccer games. It was drizzling and I was shivering, but I had just gotten back a story I wrote for a school competition. I had won first place. A blue ribbon was clipped to the top page. I was bursting with pride, clutching the papers inside my jacket to protect them from the rain. I waited for a timeout, then scurried down to my parents. "Mom, Dad, look," I said, my voice trembling with excitement as I held out the story. My dad didn't even look down. His eyes were glued to the field. "Not now, Emily. The game's about to start back up." "But Dad, I won!" "Emily, be quiet," my mom said, her voice sharp but low. She wasn't looking at me either. Ethan needs to focus. I retreated back to my seat, the blue ribbon feeling stupid and worthless. I learned my lesson that day. My accomplishments weren't just secondary, they were a distraction from what truly mattered. This pattern only got worse as we got older. On the night of my first high school formal, I came downstairs in a new dress I'd bought with my own babysitting money. I felt nervous and pretty. My hair curled for the first time. My date was waiting at the door. But when I entered the living room, my parents were hunched over the dining table with Ethan, surrounded by college brochures. He was a senior, and the all-important decision of where he would accept a football scholarship was consuming the entire household. "How do I look?" I asked, doing a small, awkward twirl. My dad grunted without looking up. My mom glanced over her shoulder, a pen behind her ear. "Oh, that's nice, dear. Don't stay out too late. John, do you think this athletic program is better than the other one?" They never even met my date. I walked out the door without a single photo being taken. My brief moment of feeling special already evaporated. 2 years later, when Ethan went to his prom, my mother spent a week helping him find the perfect tuxedo and threw a pre-prom party with half the neighborhood in attendance. By the time I reached adulthood, I had accepted this dynamic. I didn't fight it anymore. I just moved out and built my life for myself. I became a marketing consultant, and I was good at it. I was independent, I paid my own bills, I had carved a space for myself in the world far away from Ethan's shadow. But to my family, I was still just ordinary. I'd call them, excited to share a win. "I landed the Miller account today. It's the biggest one my firm has ever signed," I told my mom once over the phone. Her response was immediate and deflating. "Oh, that's nice, dear. That's great. You'll never guess what Ethan did. He's taking his whole team to a conference in Las Vegas next month, all expenses paid. Can you imagine? His boss says he's a real leader." I had spent my entire life being taught what to ignore. My own needs, my own voice, my own worth. I learned to look at my family and see only what they presented, a happy unit with a shining star at its center. So when Daniel asked me if I saw it, I was looking at that photo the same way I had learned to look at my own life. I was seeing only what I was told was important. And I had never been important. After years of feeling invisible, meeting Daniel was like learning to see in color for the first time. It happened 3 years ago. I was leading a presentation for a new marketing campaign at my firm, pitching to a major tech company. The conference room was sterile and intimidating, all glass and steel. And I was the youngest person at the table. I felt my usual wave of insecurity, the voice in my head, which sounded suspiciously like my mother's, telling me I was out of my league. Daniel was a senior executive for the client company, sitting at the far end of the long, polished table. While other executives checked their emails or shuffled papers, he was completely still, his eyes fixed on me, listening. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then Daniel spoke, his voice calm and clear. He didn't offer a polite, dismissive compliment. He asked sharp, insightful questions. "On slide 12, you referenced a demographic shift. Can you elaborate on the data source for that? It's a brilliant angle." He challenged one of my assumptions, making me defend my work and, in doing so, making my argument even stronger. He treated me not like a junior employee, but like an expert. I walked out of that room feeling a sense of professional validation I had never known. He called me the next day, not just to approve the campaign, but to ask me to dinner. On our first date, I found myself falling into old habits, downplaying my own life. When he asked about a recent promotion, I shrugged. "Oh, it was just a small thing, really. More responsibility, same office." Daniel stopped eating and looked at me, his expression serious but kind. "It wasn't a small thing, Emily. You told me you beat out 3 other candidates. That's a major achievement. You need to own your successes." No one had ever said anything like that to me before. He saw the things I had been trained to see as insignificant, and he gave them weight. A few weeks later, after a particularly draining phone call with my mom where she had spent 20 minutes talking about Ethan's new car, I was quiet and withdrawn. Daniel didn't push me to talk. He just sat next to me on the couch, put his arm around me, and waited. After a while, I mumbled, "I just feel like I'm running a race I can never win." He was silent for a moment, then said, "Then stop running their race. You're not on the same track as your brother, Emily. You're building your own, and from where I'm sitting, you're doing an incredible job." He made me feel seen. He was kind, he was successful in his own quiet way, and he was deeply supportive. He was everything my family wasn't. Naturally, they didn't like him. I brought him home for dinner about 6 months into our relationship, and the evening was an interrogation disguised as a meal. My father drilled him relentlessly. "So, marketing. What's the long-term play there? What's your 5-year plan? You have a diverse investment portfolio, I hope?" My mother watched him with a critical eye, judging the way he cut his steak, the fact that he didn't laugh loudly enough at my dad's jokes. They were measuring him against Ethan, and Daniel was nothing like my brother. Where Ethan was loud and charming, Daniel was calm and thoughtful. Where Ethan boasted, Daniel listened. Later that night, as I was helping my mom clear the dishes, she cornered me. "Well, he's certainly stable," she began, loading the word with doubt. "He is," I said, my guard immediately up. "He's a good man, Mom." She turned to me, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He's too serious, Emily. There's no spark. Are you sure he'll fit in?" Fit in. It hit me then what she meant. Serious, to my mother, meant he wouldn't play the game. He wouldn't laugh at the right times, flatter my father, or treat Ethan like a celebrity. To her, serious meant he was a threat to the family's carefully constructed performance. He wouldn't be another adoring fan in the cult of Ethan. He saw me, and by seeing me, he was a threat to the family structure that required me to be invisible. But I loved him for it. I loved him because he didn't need to be the center of attention. I loved him because when I was anxious or overwhelmed by my family's loud, chaotic energy, he would simply take my hand, and his quiet strength would flow into me, grounding me. He was my peace. With him, I didn't have to be the quiet afterthought. I could just be Emily. He was my anchor in a world that had always tried to wash me away. And now, sitting in my parents' living room, I watched that anchor break. The calm, steady man I loved was gone, replaced by a pale, terrified stranger staring at a faded photograph. His quiet strength had shattered in an instant, and the ground was falling out from under my feet. Every year, I told myself I wouldn't go, and every year I found myself sitting at my parents' dining table, a forced smile plastered on my face. This Christmas was no different. The reluctance was a heavy weight in my stomach as I pushed a piece of dried turkey around my plate. Daniel sat beside me, a solid, calming presence, though even he seemed more tense than usual in the oppressive atmosphere of my family home. The dinner conversation was a familiar performance. My father, John, held court at the head of the table, telling a long, rambling story about a golf game. The story was, of course, about how impressed his friends were that his son, Ethan, was a successful regional manager. Ethan, sitting opposite me, soaked it all in, adding dramatic embellishments and making everyone laugh on cue. My mother, Margaret, watched him with an adoring gaze, refilling his wine glass before it was even half empty. "And Daniel," my father said, turning his attention suddenly, "Emily tells us your company is downsizing. Risky business tech. You still feeling secure over there?" It wasn't a question of concern. It was a challenge, a way to measure him against Ethan's perceived stability. "I'm doing just fine, John. Thanks for asking," Daniel replied, his voice perfectly even. He reached for my hand under the table, his thumb stroking my knuckles. He knew I hated this. He was my anchor, even here. "Emily, dear, you're awfully quiet," my mother commented, though she didn't wait for an answer. "Ethan, tell your father about the deal you closed last week, the one in Portland." I faded into the background, just as I was supposed to. I became a spectator at my own family dinner. After the meal, we moved to the living room for presents. The ritual was as predictable as the dinner conversation. Ethan was presented with a top-of-the-line espresso machine, something he'd mentioned wanting months ago. He unwrapped it with performative excitement, and my parents beamed as if he'd just won an Oscar. My gift from them was a beige cardigan. It was a size too large, the kind of thing I would never wear. I knew it had been a last-minute, thoughtless purchase. Still, I put on my best grateful daughter face. "Thank you so much. It's lovely." "I thought it was practical," my mother said, her eyes already back on Ethan as he plugged in his new machine. Daniel's gift to me was a beautiful, framed first edition cover of my favorite book. It was thoughtful, personal, and it made my throat tighten with emotion. When he opened my gift to him, tickets to see his favorite band, he pulled me into a hug and kissed me, whispering, "It's perfect." For a moment, we were in our own little world. But that world was quickly invaded. "All right, who wants to see some old photos?" my mom announced, her voice booming with manufactured cheer. Before anyone could protest, she was pulling the heavy, leather-bound albums from the bookshelf. This was her favorite post-dinner activity, the Ethan Hayes highlight reel. She settled on the floor, placing the first album on the coffee table. "Oh, look! Here's Ethan's first T-ball game. He hit a home run. Remember, John?" My father chuckled. "Cleared the bases. Kid was a natural from day one." Page after page, it was the same. Ethan scoring a goal. Ethan winning the science fair. Ethan with his prom queen girlfriend. The commentary from my parents was a gushing tribute. Emily's role in this trip down memory lane was to be a blurry figure in the background, or more often, not present at all. I sat back on the couch, the oversized cardigan feeling like a costume, and watched the celebration of a childhood I was barely a part of. Daniel tried to include me. "There's Emily," he said, pointing to a small picture of me on a swing set. "Oh, yes," my mother said distractedly, already turning the page. Anyway, this next one is hilarious. This is when Ethan tried to build a treehouse. Finally, she pulled out the third album, the one before Ethan was born. Her energy shifted. These were the forgotten years, the ones that didn't fit the established narrative. She flipped through the pages more quickly, her commentary faltering. "And that's just us at a barbecue. Oh, a trip to the lake. Wait, go back," Daniel said, leaning forward. "Let me see that one." He reached for the heavy book. My mom handed it over, a flicker of something, annoyance? Anxiety in her eyes? Daniel rested the album on his lap. He slowly turned back to the page he had spotted. He was smiling at first, looking at the faded images of the woman he loved as a chubby-cheeked baby. But then his smile froze. He stopped on one page. His fingers, which had been gently tracing the edges of the photos, went still. The gentle, happy expression on his face vanished. It was like a shutter had closed, leaving his features tight and pale. He stared down at the page, his breathing so shallow I could barely see his chest move. "Dan?" I whispered, gently nudging him. "You okay?" He didn't answer. He just kept staring, his eyes wide, fixed on one specific photo. It was the group shot from the neighborhood barbecue. My dad at the grill, my mom talking to a neighbor, and me in the background, a tiny girl playing near a large oak tree. A simple, unremarkable picture. My father's jovial expression had tightened into a hard line. My mother was gnawing on her lower lip, her energy completely gone. They were watching Daniel, and there was fear in their eyes, a shared secret fear that made the hair on my arm stand up. "Daniel, what is it? You're scaring me," I said again, my voice trembling. He finally lifted his head. He looked from a photo to my mom, then to my dad, and finally his eyes locked with mine. They were dark with shock, disbelief, and a deep, painful pity that I didn't understand. He swallowed hard, and when he spoke, his voice was a raw, low whisper that cut through the festive air. Don't you see it? I took the album from his lap, my heart pounding. I looked down at the grainy picture, at the little girl who was me, and I saw nothing. Absolutely nothing. And his question hung in the silent, suffocating room, promising to destroy it all. The silence in the room was a physical thing. It was heavy and suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. My father, John, stood frozen by the fireplace, his face a thunderous mask. My mother, Margaret, had shrunk into the cushions of her armchair, her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes wide and terrified. All the festive warmth had been sucked out of the air, leaving a cold, terrifying vacuum. And in the middle of it all was me, holding the photo album, and Daniel, the man whose simple question had just detonated our lives. "See what?" I asked again, my voice sounding small and distant to my own ears. I stared down at the photograph, my eyes scanning it desperately. The image was at least 27 years old, faded and grainy. It was a chaotic scene from a summer barbecue. I looked for something out of place, something scary, a strange face in the window of the house behind us, a dangerous object lying in the grass. My mind was searching for a simple, logical threat. Daniel leaned over, his body trembling slightly. He didn't touch me, but I could feel the frantic energy coming off him in waves. He pointed with a shaky finger, not at the foreground where the main action was, but at the blurry background. "There," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "behind the big oak tree. Look." I followed his finger. My eyes struggled to focus on the grainy details. There were several people milling about in the background, their features indistinct, but he was pointing to two specific figures, standing partially in the shade of the tree. One was a young woman with dark hair, her head tilted back in a laugh. It was my mother. I recognized the dress she was wearing from other photos. She looked so young, so carefree. The other figure was a man. He was tall, with dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that was startlingly familiar. He was standing close to my mother, his arm wrapped securely around her waist, his hand resting on her hip. It wasn't a casual, friendly gesture. It was possessive, intimate. My mother was leaning into his embrace, her body language open and relaxed. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I had never seen this man before. He wasn't one of the neighbors I remembered. He wasn't a family friend. "Who is that?" I breathed, tracing the outline of the man with my fingertip. "Look at his face, Emily," Daniel urged, his voice cracking. I leaned closer, squinting. The man's face was partially obscured by shadow, but his smile was bright and clear. He had a strong jawline and deep-set eyes that seemed to sparkle, even in the faded photograph. A strange sense of recognition flickered through me. He looked familiar. I looked from the man in the photo to Daniel, who was now kneeling beside me on the floor. And then I saw it. It was like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from my lungs. The resemblance wasn't just passing, it was profound. The shape of the eyes, the way the smile crinkled the corners, the line of his jaw. It was like looking at an older, rougher around the edges version of the man I was going to marry. The world tilted, the cheerful living room dissolving into a dizzying blur. A small, choked gasp escaped my lips. The heavy album suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "What is the meaning of this?" my father boomed in, shattering the tense silence. He took a step forward, his face flushed with anger. It was his default setting. When cornered, attack. "It's just an old photo. Daniel, you are upsetting everyone. Stop this nonsense." "This isn't nonsense," Daniel shot back, not even looking at my father. His eyes were locked on mine, and they were filled with a dawning horror that mirrored my own. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "For years, my family, they never talked about him. He was the secret, the shame." My mother let out a tiny sob, burying her face in her hands. Daniel's gaze dropped back to the photograph. His voice was barely audible, a whisper of disbelief and confirmation. "I knew it. The second I saw him, I knew it. I've seen the one photo my mom keeps hidden in a box. I thought I was going crazy." He looked up at me then, his face a canvas of pain and confusion. The question he had asked me before was no longer a mystery. It was an accusation. It was the beginning of a nightmare. His hand was trembling as he reached out, his finger hovering just above the smiling man in the picture. He whispered my name, and it sounded like a plea. "Emily, don't you see it? That man, that's my Uncle Robert." The name dropped into the silent room and seemed to hang in the air, shimmering with impossible meaning. Richard? My heart didn't just stop. It felt like it was seized by an icy hand. The sound of the fire crackling, the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, my own breathing, it all vanished, replaced by a deafening roar in my ears. The world narrowed to a single point of focus, the face in the photo and the name that Daniel had just given it. Richard! My mind, numb with shock, began to scramble, desperately trying to place the name. It was familiar. I had heard it before. Then, like a flash of lightning, a memory ignited in my brain. It was from 6 months ago. Daniel and I were at his parents' house for dinner. His mother, a quiet, gentle woman named Sarah, had been showing me a small, dust-covered box of old photographs she kept in her study. They were mostly black and white portraits from her own childhood. "And this," she had said, her voice softening with a familiar sadness, as she handed me a stiff, wallet-sized photo. "This was my brother Richard." I remembered the picture perfectly. It was a formal portrait of a young man in his early 20s. He was handsome, with the same deep-set eyes as Daniel and a serious, almost brooding expression. He wasn't smiling, but there was a kindness in his face. "He's so handsome," I'd said. "He looks a lot like Daniel." Sarah had given me a sad, watery smile. "Yes, he does. Daniel has his eyes." She took the photo back, her touch gentle, almost reverent. "Richard died a long time ago, before Daniel was even born. It was a terrible accident." She had offered no more details, and her tone made it clear that the subject was closed. He was a tragedy, a ghost in their family history. Now, my brain struggled to merge two irreconcilable images. On one hand, there was the serious, tragic young man in the formal portrait, Daniel's dead uncle. On the other, there was the laughing, carefree man in the faded color photo, his arm wrapped possessively around my young mother. They were the same person. It was impossible. It made no sense. But it was true. My body knew it before my mind could accept it. A wave of nausea washed over me. A sudden, sharp snap broke my trance. I looked up. My mother, her face as pale as a sheet, had lunged forward and slammed the photo album shut. The sound echoed in the dead silent room like a gunshot. "That's enough," she cried, her voice high-pitched and strained. "I've had enough of this. You're ruining Christmas with these insane accusations." She grabbed the album from the coffee table, clutching it to her chest like a shield. But it was too late. The image was burned into my mind. The room itself seemed to shift around me. The cozy, festive space where we had laughed an hour ago now felt like a cramped, suffocating cage. The cheerful Christmas decorations looked garish and mocking. The laughter that had filled the air was now a ghost, its absence a heavy, suffocating presence. This was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, and the evidence had just been hidden away. "Get that book out of here, Margaret," my father commanded, his voice a low growl. He pointed a thick finger at Daniel. "And you. I think you've said quite enough. It's time for you to leave." He was trying to restore order, to expel the source of the chaos. He wanted to pretend the last 5 minutes had never happened. But Daniel wasn't looking at my father. He was staring at my mother, his face a mixture of disbelief and profound betrayal. He was a victim in this too. His own family's tragic story had just been twisted into something ugly and unrecognizable. "How?" Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. He wasn't asking for an explanation. It was a sound of pure, wounded confusion. "My mother told me he died in a car crash. She said he was alone. How could he have been here? In Seattle? With you?" My mother flinched as if he had struck her. She wouldn't meet his gaze. She wouldn't meet mine. She just stared at the wall, her knuckles white as she gripped the photo album. Then I looked at her. Really looked at her. I saw past the familiar face of my mother and saw a stranger, a young woman in a faded photograph with a secret. A woman so terrified that she was willing to break her own heart to keep that secret buried. The questions started exploding in my mind, one after another. How did she know Daniel's uncle? Why was it a secret? Why the intimate pose? And the darkest question of all, the one that was beginning to take shape in the depths of my horror. Why did the dead man in the photograph look so much more like me than my own father did? All my life, I thought I was an afterthought, the quiet, ignored daughter. But what if I wasn't an afterthought? What if I was the secret? The front door clicked shut behind Daniel, the sound unnaturally loud in the dead silence of the living room. My father, John, locked it and turned, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't look at me. His anger was directed entirely at my mother, who was still standing by the coffee table, clutching the photo album to her chest. "I hope you're happy, Margaret," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. 30 years. 30 years we kept this buried, and you bring it out for a Christmas party? I didn't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "How could I have known who that boy was? It was just a picture, John." "There is no just a picture, and you know it," he snapped. He stalked past both of us and disappeared down the hall towards their bedroom, slamming the door behind him. The house fell silent again, a heavy, suffocating blanket of unspoken history. Ethan, who had been watching the entire exchange with a look of utter confusion, finally spoke. "Mom, what is going on? Who was that guy?" "It's nothing, Ethan. It's adult business," she mumbled, walking past him as if in a trance. Just go to bed. Christmas is over." She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone in the wreckage of the living room. I stood there for a long time, the festive lights on the tree blinking mockingly. My mind was a whirlwind of noise. Daniel's whispered question, my father's rage, my mother's choked sobs. I felt strangely calm, a cold clarity settling over me. The quiet girl who always avoided confrontation was gone. She had died tonight, right here on this carpet. In her place was a woman who needed answers. I waited an hour, letting the sounds of the house settle. I heard Ethan go upstairs to the guest room, his footsteps heavy. The house was still. I walked into the kitchen. The main lights were off, but a small lamp over the sink cast a pale, sickly glow. My mother was sitting at the small kitchen table, her back to me, a glass of wine untouched in front of her. The photo album lay on the table beside her, closed. I pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down. The legs scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. She flinched, but didn't turn around. I kept my voice low, steady. I didn't want to fight. I wanted the truth. "Mom." She didn't answer. "I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to not lie to me." I waited until she finally, reluctantly turned her head to look at me. Her eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted. She looked older than I had ever seen her. "Why was Uncle Richard in our family photos?" I asked quietly. "Using his name, Daniel's name for him, was a deliberate choice. It was a signal that I was no longer just her daughter in this conversation. I was connected to the other side of this secret. Her voice, when it came, was a brittle whisper. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't," I said, my voice hardening slightly. "Don't do that. Don't pretend you don't know exactly what I am talking about. That man in the picture, Daniel's uncle, Richard. Why was he there?" She looked down at her hands, twisting a napkin into a shredded mess. "It was a long time ago, Emily. It was nothing. He was just a friend from the neighborhood." The lie was so weak, so transparent, it was insulting. "No," I said, leaning forward. The old Emily would have let it go, desperate to keep the peace. But I couldn't. "No, friends don't hold each other like that, Mom. And friends don't make Dad look like he wants to burn this house to the ground. Friends aren't a secret so big you have to slam a book shut to hide them." I let the words hang in the air, then I pushed harder. "And friends from the neighborhood don't just happen to be my fiancé's dead uncle, a man his family thinks died hundreds of miles from here in a car accident. So you're going to have to do better than just a friend." She started to cry then, silent, shuddering tears that ran down her face and dripped onto the table. The sight didn't soften me. It was the crying of a cornered person, not a remorseful one. "You don't understand," she sobbed. "Then make me understand," I insisted, my voice still quiet but unyielding. "Fine," she snapped, her voice cracking. "Fine. You want to know? You and that boy digging up things that should have stayed buried. Fine. He wasn't just a friend." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I waited, my entire body rigid. My mother took a shaky breath, her gaze fixed on some point in the distant past. "He was someone important," she whispered, the words barely audible. "He was someone important to me. A very long time ago. Before your father. Before all of this." She didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. The unspoken truth filled the space between us, heavy and suffocating. Richard wasn't just a friend. He wasn't just in our lives. He was woven into the very fabric of our family's hidden past. His ghost had been sitting at our dinner table my entire life, and I had never even known he was there. I looked at my mother, at the tears streaming down her face, and I felt nothing but a cold, hollow emptiness. The woman I thought I knew was gone. In her place was a stranger guarding a tomb of secrets. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was one of them. The weeks following that disastrous Christmas were a slow, agonizing bleed. The wound in our family didn't close. It festered. My father, John, moved into the guest room, and the silence in the house became a weapon he and my mother, Margaret, used against each other. Ethan, my brother, the golden boy whose world had been built on a lie, was adrift. He threw himself into his work, avoiding the house and the suffocating tension within it. His wife, Sarah, a quiet and observant woman whom my mother had always treated with a polite but firm distance, watched it all, her presence a silent judgment my mother couldn't stand. I was gone. I had walked out that Christmas day and had not looked back. My communication was limited to brief, informative texts. Daniel and I were navigating our own strange new reality, a relationship forged in a shared trauma. To my family, especially to Ethan, we were the detonators of their peace. One Sunday evening, nearly 2 months later, Ethan and Sarah came for dinner. It was my mother's desperate attempt to stitch the family back together, to pretend that a pot roast and her best china could mend a chasm that had opened between us all. The air was thick with things unsaid. After the strained and mostly silent meal, my mother asked Sarah to help her clear the plates, leaving Ethan alone with my father. It was a classic Margaret move. Divide and conquer. In the kitchen, as the water ran, she didn't speak of recipes or the weather. She got straight to the point. "You're a good girl, Sarah," she began, her voice syrupy sweet. "You have a sensible head on your shoulders. You must see that this situation with Emily has broken my son." Sarah continued to rinse a plate, her movements calm and deliberate. "Ethan is strong. We're all just trying to figure things out." "He needs stability," my mother pressed on, drying a glass that was already dry. "He needs to be surrounded by people who have his best interests at heart. No more distractions, no more drama." She paused, then placed a perfectly manicured hand on Sarah's arm. "I've always worried that you weren't the right fit. You're so quiet. Ethan needs someone more dynamic." The implication hung in the air, sharp and ugly. When Sarah didn't respond, my mother sighed dramatically. "I have deposited a check into your private savings account, $50,000. It should be enough for you to get a first start, somewhere far away from here. You can leave quietly, tell him it's not working out. He'll be devastated, of course, but he'll recover. It's for his own good." Sarah turned off the water. She looked at my mother, her expression unreadable. She said nothing. She simply dried her hands, turned, and walked back into the dining room where Ethan was now standing looking lost. "Ethan," Sarah said, her voice perfectly calm, "can we go home now?" Ethan, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere, nodded immediately. But Margaret followed them out of the kitchen, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She believed she had won. She believed Sarah would take the money and run. As they stood by the front door putting on their coats, Ethan finally looked at his wife. He saw the tension in her jaw, the profound hurt in her eyes. He asked, "What did she say to you?" His voice low. Sarah took a deep breath. She looked from Ethan to his mother, who was watching them with hawk-like intensity. "Your mother," Sarah said, her voice clear and unwavering, "offered me $50,000 to leave you." The color drained from Ethan's face. He stared at his wife, then turned his gaze to our mother. For the first time in his life, the blind adoration in his eyes was replaced by a cold, hard glare. "You did what?" he whispered. "I was protecting you," Margaret insisted, her voice rising. "After what Emily's fiancé did to this family, I won't see you ruined by another outsider." "The only person trying to ruin my life right now is you," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. But Sarah held up a hand. She looked at Ethan. "There's more," she said. "That's not the only reason I want to go home. We need to talk. It's about Daniel." An hour later, in the quiet of their own living room, Sarah laid it all out. She worked as a forensic accountant, a fact my family had always dismissed as boring. For weeks, ever since the truth about my parentage had come out, she had a terrible feeling. On a hunch, she had done some digging into Daniel's professional life and his connections to my father's small investment firm. What she found was a carefully constructed web of deceit. Daniel had used his relationship with me to gain access to client lists and sensitive financial information. He was setting up a shell company to poach my father's biggest clients, using proprietary data to undercut him. It was a quiet, brutal, and completely illegal corporate raid. Daniel wasn't just the bearer of bad news. He was a snake who had used a family tragedy as a smokescreen for his own greed. The next day, Ethan walked back into our parents' house. Sarah was with him, a folder of documents in her hand. He found our mother in the living room, staring out the window. "We need to talk," Ethan said. Margaret turned, a defiant look on her face. "If you've come to yell at me for trying to protect you from that timid little mouse..." Ethan cut her off, his voice like ice. He turned to his mother, and in that moment, he was not her golden boy. He was a man. He was a husband. "You tried to buy my wife out of my life," he said, his words sharp
and precise. You tried to get rid of the one person who is actually loyal to this family. While you were busy playing games and trying to control me, Sarah was saving Dad's company. She was saving us from Daniel's fraud. You don't deserve her loyalty, but I do." Margaret stared at him, her mouth slightly agape. All the power she had wielded over him for 30 years, all the strings she had pulled, had just been severed. He was not looking to her for approval. He was not asking for her permission. He was telling him who he was. For the first time, Sarah saw Ethan choose her, openly, without hesitation. He reached for her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a silent, unbreakable bond. He had finally stepped out of the shadow of the sun and learned to cast his own. He was no longer the family star. He was Sarah's husband. And in the ruins of their old life, they were finally ready to build a new one.
The full confession did not come that night. It came the next morning, on Christmas Day, in the cold, sterile light of a holiday that had been murdered. Daniel was gone, back to his own shocked and confused family, and I was left in the wreckage of mine. The story tumbled out of my mother in a torrent of sobs and decades of shame. She had met Richard the summer before she met my father. He was vibrant, wild, and utterly captivating. They had a whirlwind affair, a secret she kept even after she was engaged to John. She found out she was pregnant a week before her wedding. Terrified and trapped, she confessed to John, who, to avoid the social ruin and family shame, agreed to marry her anyway and raise me as his own. Richard, heartbroken and furious, was told to disappear. The story of his death in a car crash hundreds of miles away was a lie. A convenient fiction his own family was fed so he could vanish without a trace. He had died only a few years ago, alone, in a different state, under a different name. When my mother finished, the room was silent. But it was a prelude to an explosion. The carefully constructed image of the perfect Hayes family didn't just crack, it detonated. My father, John, was a man betrayed not by the past, but by its revelation. His face was a terrifying shade of purple, a vein throbbing in his temple. 30 years, he roared, his voice shaking the crystal glasses on the shelf. 30 years, I held up my end of the bargain. I gave you a life. I gave that child a name. And you couldn't keep your one promise. You let the poison out. His pain wasn't for me or for the lie we all lived. It was for his own public image, the one that had just been shattered. Ethan, the golden boy, raged. His perfect world had been a lie, his throne built on a foundation of deceit. His anger, surprisingly, was aimed at me. "You," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger. "This all started when he showed up." He meant Daniel. "You brought this into our house. My whole life, my family, it's all a joke because of you." In his mind, I wasn't the victim of the lie. I was the living embodiment of it, the flaw in his otherwise perfect story. And my mother, Margaret, the architect of it all, simply broke. She sat crumpled on the couch, her body racked with shuddering sobs. She tried to speak, to apologize, to explain, but her words were swallowed by the tidal wave of anger from the two men whose adoration she had cultivated her entire life. She was utterly, finally, alone. And me? As I stood in the eye of this hurricane of rage and grief, a strange and unexpected feeling washed over me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was relief. A profound, soul-deep relief that settled in my bones and quieted the frantic beating of my heart. Everything, every last cold shoulder and dismissive comment, every forgotten birthday and overlooked achievement, it all clicked into place. The pieces of my life, which had always felt jagged and mismatched, suddenly formed a complete, coherent picture. My father's coldness wasn't because I was a disappointment. It was because every time he looked at me, he saw the ghost of another man.
My mother's constant praise of Ethan wasn't just favoritism. It was a desperate, lifelong act of overcompensation for the daughter she could never fully claim. I wasn't an afterthought. I was a constant, painful reminder of the secret that held their marriage together. My entire childhood hadn't been a failure on my part to be good enough. It had been a performance on theirs, and I was the evidence they were constantly trying to hide in plain sight. The yelling continued, a cacophony of blame and betrayal, but I wasn't a part of it anymore. I was just an observer. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to cling to the wreckage of this family, begging for apologies they were incapable of giving. The truth, however ugly, had set me free. They could have their drama. I chose peace. Quietly, I walked to the hallway and picked up my coat and my purse. Their yelling faltered as they all turned to look at me, the silent center of their storm. I looked at John. "Thank you for giving me a home," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I'm sorry it cost you so much." I looked at Ethan. "Goodbye, Ethan." Finally, I looked at my mother, her face streaked with tears and mascara. "I hope you find some peace, Mom." I didn't wait for a response. I turned, walked to the front door, and opened it. The cold December air hit my face, and it felt like the first clean breath that I had ever taken. I walked down the steps and didn't look back. Daniel was there, parked down the street, just as he said he would be. I got into the passenger seat. The warmth of the car enveloped me. He didn't say a word. He just looked at my face, and I knew that he understood. He reached over and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. His touch was my new reality. As we drove away, I watched the house that was never truly my home shrink in the rearview mirror until it was gone. We were connected now, Daniel and I, by a story that was more complex and tragic than I could ever have imagined. He had lost the uncle he never knew, and I had found the father I never had. It was a strange and painful foundation, but it was real. And as we drove towards the future, leaving the chaos and the lies behind us, I knew we would build our own family on that foundation. Not on perfection, but on the quiet, resilient strength of a truth that had finally, painfully, seen the light of day. Have you ever had a family secret revealed in the most unexpected moment? A whispered comment? A forgotten letter? Or a photograph that changed everything? Share your story in the comments below. If my story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow for more stories of betrayal, survival, and poetic justice, because sometimes the past whispers louder than the present.